Thank you for that introduction. And it is nice to have this opportunity to talk about clubroot. It is a disease that my group's been working on for a long time. And the group of authors here are the people who are currently working on clubroot, but there have been many grad students and others over the years. So clubroot is caused by an organism, Plasmodium brassicae. And at one time it was considered a fungus. Now it's in the kingdom Chromista, which also includes downy mildew. So the taxonomy is not all that important, but it does sometimes help explain why this organism is so difficult to control. And from time to time, I remind my grad students that it's actually more closely related to the organism that causes malaria than it is to a fungus. Attacks most plants in the family Brassicaceae, and it has spread around the world, so it's a problem most places where brassicas are grown. It causes this growth on the roots, which results in poor uptake of water and nutrients, so plants are stunted. They wilt when it's hot and dry, and it can lead to plant death when the disease is serious. One of the problems is that it produces resting spores that survive in the soil for a long time. And there are a lot of different strains or pathotypes of this organism. That's not as important for vegetable growers as it is for canola growers, but it is something to be aware of, especially if anyone's growing resistant variety. It does attack a number of field crops, especially canola. But here's a list of vegetable crops in the Brassica family that are hosts of clubroot. And then there's ornamentals like alyssum and lots of the brassica weeds like pennycress and shepherd's purse. So just quickly review the life cycle. Mention these resting spores that survive in the soil for a very long time. When a susceptible host or some other crops are grown in a field, that stimulates the resting spores to germinate. They produce zoospores, which can actually move through the soil, and they're attracted to the root hairs of plants, especially young seedlings. So the root hairs are infected, and the organism actually multiplies within the root hair up to 20 times, and then releases more of these mobile zoospores. And these are the ones that, again, move in the soil, and they infect the main root of the crop. Within the root, they start to multiply. They actually can move from cell to cell, and that causes the characteristic swelling and damage to the root. Here's the infected roots on Shanghai pak choi. And in a relatively short time, 6 to 8 weeks, the resting spores mature. These infected roots start to rot in the field, break down, and they release the resting spores back into the soil, where again, they can persist for a relatively long time. We say this is monocyclic. It only has one life cycle on a crop. But if you're growing a short season crop, like some of the Chinese vegetables, you could get clubroot developing on each successive crop. And even though it persists in the soil for a long time, it doesn't multiply there. It is an obligate pathogen, so it does need a living host to reproduce and grow. So there's been recommendations for management of clubroot around for vegetable crops for a long time. This is from University of California. It can be dispersed from field to field using field-grown transplants, and especially movement on infested soil or in surface water. And I'll touch on some information about these as I go through the talk. So one of the first recommendations, of course, is try not to move it from field to field. The next one is a 2-year rotation away from susceptible crops. And it's interesting to me that they mention cereals because I do have some information on grass cover crops or cereals that can help reduce the disease. pathogen-free transplants and soilless mix. If field-grown transplants are used, grow in fumigated beds. We've done some work on fumigation. We've looked at movement or survival of spores in irrigation water. And then the big one for vegetable growers is add lime or do something to increase the pH to 7.2 or above, but it just doesn't work for everyone. And then there are resistant vegetable crops. Some growers have taken to these much more than others. The Midwest vegetable recommendations are pretty much the same, although I've seen this recommendation before that says some clovers are possible hosts of the plant and grasses. And to me, this is more of misinterpretation, if you will. There was one published paper that said clover could be infected, but to my mind, they didn't really look at it closely enough to prove that it was actually clubroot. We do need to worry about the weeds. A lot of these are the same, except this rotate for 5 to 7 years. That used to be a standard for Ontario as well, and I'll explain why that's changed to the 2 years. The fungicides that are recommended or offered as an option, I'll mention those as well. So spread. There's a lot more concern about this in Western Canada. You can see a dust storm from the prairies. Fortunately, they've found that movement in dust really isn't very effective. In Western Canada, a lot of the movement is on soil from an infested field, moving to a field without the disease. But some vegetable growers don't have this issue because they don't have the contract workers that are coming in to seed or harvest for them. So certainly there are growers that have been growing broccoli and other cole crops for decades, and they haven't introduced the disease to their fields. But water erosion, again, this is a picture from Western Canada. It can certainly spread the pathogen, and there are reports of it spreading in irrigation water as well. So one other thing to be concerned about with clubroot is the concentration of those resting spores in the soil. If we have less than 1,000, there'll probably be no disease. At 1,000, you might see a few tiny little clubs develop if the conditions are optimum for disease. And it's when we get up to 100,000 or 1,000,000 resting spores per gram of soil that we see this severe clubbing that can actually kill a plant. So the conditions that are conducive to disease, relatively warm temperatures, compacted soil, and pH from 5.5, getting up close to that 7 level. But we can still get high disease severity even when conditions aren't great if we have really high concentrations in soil. So this is an example of what we can actually see in the field, and part of the reason why it can be so difficult to see an effect of some of the management practices. So here we're looking at 100 million resting spores per gram, and quite a bit of research has shown that left on its own, the numbers of resting spores drop quite dramatically in the first 2 years of a crop rotation. But after that, there's very little change in the numbers, out to 6 years at least. So we could have a really effective control, fumigation, fungicide, something else. If we're spraying a fungicide and we get 90% control, we think that's pretty effective. We can even go to 99%, which is usually all we need to control a disease. But if we're starting at these high numbers, we can still end up with more resting spores than that 1 million per gram. So on paper is a really effective method of control, but in the field, you're still getting 100% disease severity. It looks like the control wasn't effective at all. This is some real data from a canola field in Saskatchewan. They were looking at gypsum to raise the calcium levels, wheat as a rotation crop. They did look at solarization, which isn't always possible on a large scale. starting out at 128 million resting spores per gram, a really high number. But if you're growing a susceptible crop for 2 or 3 years, you can get to that number. And if we look at the black line here, this is untreated, nothing in the field. We're seeing that drop after the first year, drop after the second year, and then with some of these treatments, little or no difference after the third year. So here we have the wheat treatment, and we're seeing the same pattern. Looks like there's a positive trend. Unfortunately, no significant differences in this trial because there's a certain amount of variability. But this decline over the first 2 years is interesting, but then also there's really very little change from 2 to 6 years after that. So that's where the recommendation for the 2-year break comes from. We see that decline in the first 2 years. So you can understand where the 5 to 7 came from, because you can still have resting spores over 5 to 7 years. But waiting that extra time isn't really going to produce much of a difference. And we're not really sure why, but most of the spores do die off naturally in the first 2 years. And it's that 2% or 10% that survive that are the ones that can live 10 or 20 years in the soil. And if anyone's familiar with white rot on onions, it tends to respond the same way. You get a small proportion that survives for a very long time. Of course, when you have that break, you don't want anything that's susceptible like weeds. And we do say avoid most brassica cover crops. There are a few that are resistant that I'll mention later. And of course, there's lots of good reasons to follow crop rotation above and beyond managing clubroot. We saw that there may be a benefit to wheat. Are there other cover crops or rotation crops that could help reduce the resting spores in soil? Different people have done some work on this. We do get infection of root hairs on crops like ryegrass that aren't normally considered a host. So the resting spores are germinating, they're infecting the root hairs, they're building up to higher numbers. But then when they go to infect the main root, either they can't infect it or they get in a little bit, but they can't actually fulfill the life cycle. So there's no resting spores that are formed. In theory, at least, this helps drop the numbers down faster than it would if there was no crop. And we did some work on this in greenhouse and controlled environment, where we put in a known number of resting spores at the start, grew some ryegrass and some other grasses that are perennial cover crops, waited for 8 weeks, and then did some molecular methods to look at how many resting spores were left. So we ended up actually with a few more resting spores than we thought. We didn't see a significant reduction with some of the ryegrass, although we're going from 10 million to 9 million to 4 million. Some of the other ryegrass and other grasses did result in a significant reduction, but we're still over that million resting spores. However, this was only 8 weeks, so you would expect that over a longer period during the summer, or if we have perennial cover crops, it would be even more effective. And one of the advantages of using a cover crop or perennial crop is that it holds that infested soil in place, so it reduces the risk of moving it to another field. So that explains one of the recommendations for managing clubroot. They also talk about disease-free transplants, which makes a lot of sense. And a lot of researchers have found this out by trial and error, but it's very interesting that some of the commercial soilless mixes are not good for clubroot development, where others are really good for getting high levels of disease. So 2 that we found that don't support clubroot very much are Promix, BX. Seems like they come with different beneficials in them, BM6. And for research, we use different types of sunshine mix because they do allow a lot of clubroot to develop. There might be something in the soilless mix that might leach out of the plug, protect the roots after they're transplanted into infested soil. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to see that in the field. But the selection of soilless mix certainly helps the plants get off to a better start. If we use LA4 for our research, we get 90% disease severity. With BM6 or ProMix, this is down to 2%. So from a research point of view, we really don't want to use these, but from a production point of view, it's good to know that there's several out there that don't support clubroot. One of the other concerns is that clubroot can spread in runoff and possibly in irrigation water. So recently, a graduate student looked at survival of the resting spores over time. These are days, so 150 days or 5 months, under different temperature conditions. If we put the resting spores in water and then freeze it, if we just leave it out at room temperature in our lab, if we put it in the refrigerator at 4 Celsius, or if we freeze and thaw it. So it was a bit of a surprise to me that the resting spores did survive for such a long time. It started off with 90%, drops down quite a bit in the first week or so, but you still have over 60% viable resting spores. And then we still have 60% survival in the freezer. Even with freeze and thawing, we can still have 30% of those resting spores that are alive. We also confirmed this with a bioassay where we took these spores at each different stage, inoculated a susceptible crop, and yes, they were able to cause clubroot on a susceptible crop in the growth room. So they can really survive for quite a long time. You can imagine if there's runoff in the spring into an irrigation pond or water that you're using for irrigation, there's still going to be a good proportion of them that are alive and will be able to infect. So I'm be talking about a few field trials that we've been doing, and just wanted to point out that these are done on very high organic matter soils, 50 to 80%. I guess we're fortunate in that part of our station is naturally infested with this pathogen. So we've been able to do a lot of field trials over the years. I've known for a long time that higher pH suppresses clubroot, and 7.2 is usually that magic number. We've wondered if this was mostly due to calcium, because usually pH is increased by adding lime, or if it was just the pH. So we tried to figure that out by adding gypsum, doesn't affect the pH. Potassium bicarbonate increases the pH, but is not adding calcium. Lime, which is the standard, increases pH and adds calcium. And we looked at another product that contained calcium and silicon with the idea that maybe the silicon would help reduce disease as well. So the products were spread in the spring, incorporated. We waited a couple of weeks and then seeded susceptible pak choi, which is our standard short season vegetable that we use for these assays. And here's the clubroot severity. The gypsum by itself, just calcium without affecting pH, had no effect. The other products that did affect pH, whether they involve calcium or not, did decrease disease. But you'll notice that it's not 100% reduction. It's more of 40 to 50% reduction in the severity of clubroot that develops. And we've seen this in other trials as well. This was a controlled environment study. We'll focus on the pH first, but we were also looking at the effects of different temperatures. So 25 Celsius, which I think is about 80 Fahrenheit, is in the optimum range for this pathogen to germinate and infect. And then we find very little disease at colder temperatures, like 10 and 15 Celsius. But the one important point here is even at pH 8, when we've got optimum temperature, we're still at 40%. At 20 Celsius, if I was a grower and I got the pH up to 8, I'd still think that 40% clubroot was a lot. And unless I had a check in the field where the pH was 6, so I could see what the difference was, it would look like modifying the pH wasn't really very effective. This is what we see in some of our field plots. This is canola. The higher pH, the plants are pretty healthy. You can see that they're flowering, they will produce yield. And then at pH 6.3, they're wilting in the middle of the day, they're stunted. Some of these are going to die. So, real example of how modifying pH affects disease development. But back to temperature, this is a trial where we looked at temperature by changing the seeding date. When we grow these pak choi, it's 6 or 8 weeks in the field to maturity. When we seed it early in the season, when the soil temperatures are cool, we have relatively low disease at harvest. This is area under the disease progress curve. So they were looking at disease development throughout the growth of the plant. But you can see when temperatures are optimum, high disease. But the interesting thing is that when we seed in mid-August and we're harvesting in October, very little clubroot develops. And again, seeding in September with these short season crops, even less clubroot. This isn't going to work for late storage cabbage, maybe, but it is useful to keep in mind that seeding when the soil is cool can suppress clubroot. And if you're growing a short season crop, you don't have to worry about clubroot nearly as much if you're growing that crop later in the season. Some research from 1983 on organic soil in Ohio found much of the same thing. They looked at a range of crops from radish to cabbage, and 14 Celsius, some very low levels, but this range from about 18 to 26, high amounts of disease. And then when it starts to get warm, clubroot drops off again. So just to review temperature and clubroot, we see very little disease development at temperatures below 14 Celsius. If conditions are optimum, you get infection of the plants within about 3 weeks. But even if temperatures are warm enough for infection, say in August or September, if the temperatures drop off, there's very little clubroot that actually develops. So again, temperature is really important, but it's not the only factor we have to consider. So if you do have a real problem in your seed bed where you want to plant transplants, or if you've got a patch that's very severe and you're wondering if it's possible to get rid of the pathogen, fumigation might be an option. And we've looked at this again. This is on organic soil. I just want to say we've tried a few times to do trials on mineral soil, where of course most of the cabbage and other brassicas are grown. And we just have a really difficult time finding a site. Often the growers are already applying lime, so there's little or no clubroot that develops, even though the pathogen's in the field. So we've ended up doing most of our work on these high organic matter soils. And we've looked at chlorpicrin and metam sodium. We do have a small plot fumigator. If you fumigate, you have to cover with film. And we did use a totally impermeable film, left it for 2 weeks, then grew the pak choi again and assessed after 5 weeks. So we could see that the pak choi was healthier, fewer plants, a lot more weeds in our non-treated check. And when we looked at the numbers, 80% severity in the untreated, fumigants definitely reduced the amount of disease. But the interesting thing was that even where we had no fumigant, but we did have just the covering, we were also getting essentially the same reduction in disease. And we were wondering, because we did this in the middle of the summer, were we getting a solarization effect? But we did look at the temperatures under the tarps, and it wasn't as high as required for solarization. And usually solarization takes 6 or 8 weeks under the tarp. But we're thinking that because we've got such high organic matter soils, that we're getting some effects of anaerobic soil disinfestation. There's been a lot of interest in this approach in Europe, where most fumigants are not permitted. To my mind, it takes a lot of time and effort and resources, but if you don't have fumigants and there's a real problem, it could be a solution. And just so you can see what this looked like, high clubroot in our non-treated check, where we had fumigation, mostly no clubroot, where we just see these tiny little side clubs that don't affect the growth of the plant at all. So I'm going to finish up with a little bit on fungicides and then also talk a bit at the end about a biocontrol that we're looking at. So fluazanam, called Omega in the States, Allegro in Canada, is really the go-to product. There's reports in the literature that this Nebigen works well, but we can't get it. And Terrachlor, PCNB, in the past has been quite effective. I see it is registered in the States. It's not an option in Canada. And there has been work on different surfactants. Some of them do suppress clubroot. Some damage the plants, and none of them are registered. And we did a trial over 2 years, and we were wondering if we were seeing some resistance to fungicides, although it may actually just be that they're not as effective under high disease pressure. So I'm going to show you that research. These are clubroot-resistant cabbages. There are a range of them available. You can see disease severity here is very low. And then we looked at a susceptible cabbage bronco, and we were wondering if we applied a fungicide such as fluazanam to the susceptible cabbage, if we could get disease control equivalent to growing a resistant cultivar. Because growers aren't always as thrilled with some of the qualities of the resistant crops compared to the ones that they're familiar with growing. Adding fluazanam, numerically it reduced disease severity, although this wasn't statistically different, but adding fluazanam didn't come close to reducing disease compared to just growing a resistant cabbage. And then if we look here, bronco plus fluazanam, or the susceptible bronco alone, almost 100% disease severity, and still very low or no disease in the resistant cabbages. So we were wondering what was happening here. All of a sudden, it seemed like the fluazanam wasn't working at all. One question is fungicide resistance, but we don't expect that after just 1 year. And fluazanam is the type of fungicide where we shouldn't see resistance develop anyway. So it may be that when we've got higher disease pressure, those optimum temperatures, more soil moisture, we just get high disease. And under those conditions, the fluazanam is just not effective. So this could help explain different experiences that growers have when they use fluazanam. Seems like sometimes it's quite effective and sometimes not so much. So resistant vegetable varieties could be a useful approach. The clubroot pathogen exists in lots of different strains or pathotypes that will infect one crop but not another, or one cultivar that's got a resistance gene but not another. Most of the surveys show that vegetable fields with clubroot have pathotype 6. This can cause very high disease on vegetables. It doesn't infect canola as much, which is interesting. Of course, just to make things more complicated, plant breeders in Europe have come out with a different system to pathotype clubroot on Brassica vegetables, so different from the original Williams system that was from the University of Wisconsin. But the pathotype that might exist in your field isn't really a concern unless you're growing a resistant variety and plan on growing it consistently in a single field. We've screened lots of varieties over the years, And again, very dramatic differences between the susceptible crop. I hate looking at all those weeds that grow up because the crop's so slow at growing versus the resistant ones that look very healthy. And again, this is just some broccoli. Sorry, the resistant one is over here, and you can almost hardly see the broccoli because it's small, wilted, and so many weeds. And we have reports on all of these if anyone's interested. And I'm not going to show you the results, but there are several Napa cabbages that also have very effective resistance to clubroot. So when we're looking at resistance, way at the beginning, I talked about avoiding Brassica cover crops. And field crop growers use a lot of Brassica cover crops. Our growers on the marsh tend to use oilseed radish and daikon and some of the others as well. So we did 2 years of screening all the available Brassica cover crops we could find to look at their susceptibility or resistance to clubroot. And not surprising, a whole lot of them were susceptible. This is all compared to that susceptible Shanghai pak choi. But it was also useful to find out that a lot of the daikon radishes sold as tillage radish and some of the others were quite or totally resistant. And there were turnips and some others that were resistant as well. But there's turnips that are very susceptible. So it's really important to check the varieties for those. So I'm just going to wrap up with some kind of fun or interesting work that we've been doing to look at a potential biocontrol for clubroot. There's a fungus, Beauveria bassiana, that's sold in a number of commercial formulations. We looked at Bioseries and Botanigard. These are registered to control insects on plants, often in the greenhouse. This fungus also colonizes plants as an endophyte, so it actually grows within the plant. And there were some reports that it would help protect plants against clubroot. And we thought that cabbage or other brassica vegetables would be ideal because we would grow them as transplants normally anyway. We'd apply the endophyte while they're still in the plug trays, so it gets a chance to colonize the plant and the roots before it's actually exposed to the disease. So we produced the transplants in a standard fashion, then transplanted them into other pots where we inoculated with the pathogen to simulate putting the transplant into field soil. And when we assessed for disease 6 weeks later, and we also looked at different concentrations of the pathogen, because often biocontrols work better under low disease pressure than they do under high disease pressure. So with high disease, we did find a significant reduction, especially with Botanigard. Similarly, moderate, this is reduction with Bioseries, but a bigger reduction with Botanigard. And then under low pressure, both of them reduce disease. In our second repetition of the trial, we didn't start with as much disease, so we didn't see quite the same significant differences. In 2021, we got great reduction in insect damage, but we saw no effect on clubroot. The next year, we saw a reduction in clubroot, no difference in insect damage, no effect of either one in the field in 2023. And again, last year, unfortunately, low clubroot and low insect damage. So we didn't have a useful experiment. However, in 2024, where there was no clubroot, I was really surprised to see a big increase in plant growth where we applied this endophyte, essentially double what we were seeing in the check. And it's not quite as easy to see in here, but I think you can see these smaller cabbage plants were the untreated check compared to the cabbage plants with the product. And we're quite interested in this improved growth. We see the reduction clubroot under the greenhouse. We're going to try this one more year in the field and the greenhouse. There's a concern that, like so many biocontrols, they work great under controlled conditions, but as soon as you put them in the field, not as effective for various reasons. So just to summarize, what can we do when clubroot's in a field? A 2-year break does help to reduce the resting spores in the soil. And if you're starting at 1,000,000, a 2-year break can be extremely effective in reducing the spore counts. Of course, you want to reduce susceptible weeds and anything else that might be building up clubroot in those break years. pH has been the go-to method of managing clubroot for 50, 80 years. And in many cases, it works really well, but I hope I showed you some of the reasons why you might not see as much of an effect as we'd expect or hope. Temperature does have a real effect on clubroot development. The cover crops aren't going to be a major method to reduce resting spores, but again, there's other reasons to use cover crops. If you're already rotating with a cereal grain or using it as a cover crop, there could be a benefit to clubroot. And check out the clubroot resistant cultivars if you think that they will fit into your production system. So all of the work that we've done is in our annual report. These are available on the website going back many years. If you Google Ontario Crops Research Centre, Bradford, it'll come up under publications. So there've been all kinds of groups that have funded this work over the years. And I hope there's time for some questions.